We've been critiquing the system of categories with regard to race, noting how they have changed over time and how the lines of demarcation between one race and another are arbitrary at best. The arbitrariness of racial differences is especially noticeable when we compare different societies. Different societies use different criteria to separate people into racial categories. And again, this just highlights the fact that race is socially constructed, just like gender and sexuality. For example, the same individual who was considered to be black in the United States might actually be considered white in Brazil. To understand how that's possible, let's start by examining how race is defined in our culture. Then we'll contrast that understanding of race with the approach they use in Brazil. Race is constructed differently within these two cultures. Here in the United States, race depends on our ancestry. Historically, and to this day, we tend to legally categorize people based on what is called the one-drop rule, which is also known as hypodescent. This means that if you have any blood of a race other than white, whether Asian, Hispano-Latinx, Black, Indigenous, or whatever, you are considered to be a member of that other race, no matter what you look like. In effect, this system was set up with the express purpose of maintaining the purity of the white race by excluding people from whiteness, creating a white versus non-white dichotomy. This approach is a reaction to the fact that, as human beings, we can have children across racial lines. That in and of itself highlights how race is a social construction, independent of our humanity, which is biological. But people were willing to go to all kinds of ridiculous lengths to protect whiteness in this country, to protect this socially constructed system of race based on hypodescent. As you might expect, identifying race by blood becomes incredibly complicated and intricate when it is all about ancestry and the one-drop rule. For example, in the old Civil War era South, white people separated out those who might appear to be white, but who weren't, according to the one-drop rule. They did this by giving them special names, distinguishing, for example, between, and I know these terms are offensive today, they distinguished between those identified as mulatto, quadroon, and octoroon, meaning between those who were 1/2, 1/4, and 1/8 black. Here's some pictures of those who are considered to be quadroon and octoroon. But notice that they're still defined as black, even if only 1/8 black. This is because of the one-drop rule. White people didn't think of them as 7/8 white, even when they looked white. How odd is that, right? But again, the point of this kind of calculation was to make the white category an exclusive club. The book One Drop of Blood, The American Misadventure of Race, recounts this history. It describes how, quote, European settlers in the New World began to imagine themselves as white soon after their arrival on these shores. Over time, whiteness became a powerful, flexible means of uniting these otherwise disparate men and women, for it defined them against Native Americans, African slaves, and finally against the group that was to become America's domesticated other, African Americans. The one-drop rule was the foundation of this process, and by the late 19th century, it had become a virtual law of nature among white Americans, end quote. The author points out what the one-drop rule achieves, noting that, quote, the sum of what you were not, indigenous, black, slave, made you what you were, and it still does. The proposition that whiteness as such has no content, but is rather a negation, the identity of not being black, is a shocking revelation to most white Americans who continue to imagine that there is a non-racist way of defining their whiteness in positive terms, although they are tongue-tied when asked to say what it is. Were the nation ever to acknowledge this, the result would be a cultural revolution that would outdo the 1960s. End quote. The point here is that in our culture, biology and ancestry are given paramount importance when defining race. We give meaning to our biology, and that has very real consequences for inclusion and exclusion. But this is largely a characteristic of our culture, that we focus entirely on blood and biology as determinants of race. Other cultures do it differently, looking at more than just blood, and in some, culture and appearance are actually more important than biology in defining one's race. In Brazil, for example, it's your total physical appearance that decides your race. For example, those of mixed ancestry who are perceived as white would be white in Brazil. So physical appearance is very important in Brazil, much more so than in the United States. But at the same time, your social class plays a role as well. The more money you have, the more white you are considered to be. So Brazilians have sayings like, quote, money whitens, or a rich black is a white man, and a poor white man is black. In our culture, if we want to be offensive, we say poor whites are white trash or trailer trash, terms which are horribly derogatory, but notice that they're still considered to be white. So, here we have a separation between those with light skin from those with dark skin, and it's strongly correlated with social class. In fact, you'll see elements of the system throughout Latin America. The question is, how did this happen? Starting during the colonial period in Latin America, so starting during the 17th century, a 5-tier hierarchy emerged, sorting all the people in the colonies, and you'll still find elements of the system lingering to this day. At the very top were los españoles, also known as peninsulares. These were individuals who were born in Spain and Portugal, the Iberian Peninsula, thus the name. They largely served as colony governors, functionaries of the crown, archbishops and religious superiors, and so on. What set them apart was that they were born and raised in Europe, and this gave them a higher status than even white people in Latin America. Below them were those white people born and raised in the colonies of Latin America, los criollos. These individuals were landowners and ranchers who generally received land grants from the colonial governments, which means land taken from indigenous populations. So this is where wealth was being generated. They also had access to those serving in the government, so they had the advantage of connections. Then there were those of mixed ancestry, who might be mestizo, mixed white and indigenous, mulatto, mixed white and black, or sambo, mixed indigenous and black. And again, please forgive my language here. These terms are highly offensive in today's context. These groups were most likely to be agricultural or construction workers, artisans, and so on. Below this group were los indios, the indigenous population. If they were participating in colonial life at all, they could be in the lower levels of the military or security forces, work as suppliers for mines and plantations. And then at the bottom were los negros, the slaves who were taken from Africa, as well as their descendants, who were forced to work in the mines and on plantations. As you may have noticed from this middle category, there was a lot more mingling of different races in Latin America than there was in the United States during this time period. It was far more common and socially acceptable. In fact, you can find many paintings of mixed-race families. In this case, you have someone who is either un españole or criollo, married to someone who may be indio or mestizo, and who have a mestizo child. And over the centuries, this mixed race category became the most numerous, though patterns will vary from one part of Latin America to another. You should also notice how class and race got intertwined in this system. For example, not all white people were equal. What made the difference wasn't race so much as where you were born and raised, as well as the status you had or your position within the colonial structure. Those of mixed race were not only defined by their ancestry, but also by their position within the employment structure of society. The same goes for los indios y los negros. Finally, notice that this image portrays the class status structure of society, but it also is arranged by color, with the whitest at the top and those with the darkest skin tones at the bottom. So this is where physical appearance began to matter. For example, those who were of mixed race, but who appeared white, could move up. In other words, over time, those in the criollo category could actually have some mixed ancestry, though to all outward appearances, they were white. That could never happen in the United States because of the one-drop rule. Okay, let's wrap this up. As we've seen, in Latin America, a lot of importance is placed on visual cues, and it is tied very closely with class. When we meet in person, we'll also take a quick look at the system in China and other Asian nations, so this kind of system is pretty widespread. But in the United States, we have a history that's much more concerned with heredity and familial descent, and less concerned with class. You're getting the sense that the United States is the odd one out when it comes to focusing exclusively on blood quantum, and more recently appearance, and not including class as happens in other parts of the world. That raises the question of why. Why do you think that whiteness includes people of all classes here in the United States, when that clearly isn't the case in other parts of the world? I look forward to discussing this together with you in person.